How can you really know where something was made, or even what it's made of? It's easy to tell with real-life things, but what about the content on our screens? Now more than ever, verified authenticity is critical, especially with the advent of AI. That's why a global community, including companies, organizations, and civic leaders, have come together in the Content Authenticity Initiative. The movement's goal is to promote universal adoption of content credentials, the open standard for content authenticity and provenance that can be attached to images, video and audio files, documents, and more. Think of it as a digital nutrition label. Camera and software companies are already including it in their products. You can choose to embed content credentials in your files and make it clear for people to review. You can interact with this icon to see the origin and edit history of the file. Content credentials can be stored in the cloud for added durability. The underlying technology implements the C2PA open standard, and the Content Authenticity Initiative is helping make it more widespread with free open source tools. On top of that, we're working with educators, policymakers, creators, and the industry to speed up the adoption of content transparency. Together, we can create a world with trust and transparency built into what we create, share, and see online.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us here today. My name is Santiago Lyon, and I head up Advocacy and Education for the Content Authenticity Initiative. As you saw from that video, the initiative is aimed at accelerating adoption of the open technical standard around content provenance that comes from the C2PA, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, which is an organization that Adobe helped to set up within the Linux Foundation as a joint development foundation project, together with other major players in the technology space. What we're focused on is understanding the origins of digital content, where it came from, how it might have been modified, and then sharing some or all of that information with the viewers. By way of introduction, my background is in journalism. I spent more than 3 decades working in the news agency business as an award-winning photographer, media executive, educator, and it's my great pleasure to be having a conversation today with my colleague, Eric Scouten, who is the Identity Standards Architect on the Content Authenticity Initiative and heads up something called the Creator Assertions Working Group. Before I get going with Eric, I wanted to just highlight the difference between all these alphabet soup of acronyms we have. The CAI is, as I mentioned, the Content Authenticity Initiative aimed at accelerating adoption of the C2PA standard, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. And the CAWG is focused on the identity aspects of provenance. Broadly speaking, provenance has 2 distinct parts: how something was created, the technical details, device model, AI model, etc., and who did that, an individual or an organization. And what we have done is separated those how and who to make it easier for parties that are interested in one or the other to focus on that, but then bring them together for those parties that are interested in both of them. Eric Scouten, it's a great pleasure to work with him. He's the Identity Standards Architect on all of this, has a long and distinguished career in technology dating back many decades. And with that, I'll get him up on stage and we can start our conversation.
I'm Eric Scouten. I'm Identity Standards Architect at Adobe. And in that role, I help define technical standards and also implement those technical standards for how identity plays into the overall C2PA ecosystem. So we define standards such as an identity assertion, which is binding a digital credential to a piece of content that somebody's created, a metadata assertion that allows people to state arbitrary content, and then a training and data mining assertion that allows people to specify their intentions with regard to how AI generative models can use their content.
I think it's fair to say that identity is one of those sort of outliers as it relates to digitization. You know, most of the time when we're asked to prove our identity, currently we have to pull out a piece of paper or a piece of laminated plastic with our picture on it, whereas most other things we seem to be doing digitally, which makes identity important in the sense that it has to catch up with everything else. And that's why the digital identity aspects of the work here are so important. We need a reliable way to prove who we are online. And that's really, in addition to the work that Eric does with the Content Authenticity Initiative, that's a key component of digital identity. So, Eric, you described what CAWG is, CAWG, and what you do. Could you explain CAWG's role within the broader Content Authenticity Initiative and why this who aspect of credentials is such a critical part of the puzzle?
So, let's think about news reporting as one example, and there are many others like it. But in the case of news, I think it's really interesting to know who it is who is providing the information to you. So, a piece of video footage showing a piece of violence or an act of violence happening in a particular context means a lot more if it's a reputable news organization such as the BBC or similar organizations stating that this event happened at this time and in this place, versus me, an unknown person, with no reputation in news reportage, saying the same thing. So to be able to understand that the piece of media that you're viewing really comes from a particular reputable news source, and then you can make your decision about whether you trust that news source or not. But to know that you have some confidence in who it is that is presenting that information to you, I think is critically important in understanding the distinction between misinformation and real information.
I think, Jen, you're going to show us some clips about how Adobe, for example, addresses identity in a new product we have out called Adobe Content Authenticity that allows creators to attach identity to content after the fact.
Yes.
Let's dive into the app and see how it works. You can find the Content Authenticity app at content.authenticity.adobe.com. If you click Get Started, it'll take you to the Apply Content Credentials screen, where you can upload your files. Before we do that, however, let's check out the preferences in the upper left. This is where you can set up and manage the information to include in your content credentials. The first option is to verify your name through LinkedIn. Now, you don't have to do this, but it is a great way to include additional authentication in your credentials. As you can see, I've already verified my name through my LinkedIn account. Next, you can connect some of your social media accounts, so that information will be included in your content credentials. Finally, down at the bottom, you can add a statement to your credentials requesting that generative AI models not train on or use your content for training purposes. This is part of a growing industry standard led by Adobe to protect creator opt-outs. And supporting AI models such as Adobe Firefly respect this.
Great.
So I want to follow up with that and say that what we're doing for Adobe Content Authenticity is really intended largely for individual content creators. So you'll see that the kinds of things that are available there are really tailored to what we've heard from individual and freelance content creators. These are the kinds of identity signals that they're used to thinking about when they talk about digital identity. And so I want to expand on that a little bit and ask Jen to show a couple of prototypes that we have or samples of user experience that we have that are related to the other side of ACA, which is what we call verify, which is showing you what the content looks like when somebody else has produced it and you are asking questions about who produced that. So Jen, if you could put the first of those up on screen, please. So in the example that Sean showed, he was walking through how you identify yourself to ACA as a contributor. And this is now looking at a piece of content that another person here called Julie Smith, or Jane Smith, went through those verification steps, produced a piece of content that you're seeing a thumbnail of here. And then those social signals that were attached to this creator are now available on screen. But I mentioned earlier, we're also talking about how do you do this for major institutional customers, news media, entertainment, recorded music, so on and so forth. So if you could move to the next slide. And that'll show if you were to drag a piece of content that comes from a news media organization, as an example, what would that look and verify? And here we're showing that we have understood that this is a piece of content produced by the BBC, and going through a program that the news media has, news media organizations have organized through IPTC, which says this is a recognized news media organization through what they call their Origin Verified Publisher program. And we recognize that, and we say that this is in fact the BBC and not somebody who's stolen the BBC logo and slapped it on a piece of content. So if you could go to the next slide. This shows the use of that in concert with the CAWG metadata assertion, which we'll talk to a bit later. But that basically allows the BBC to provide some additional information about the particular piece of content that you're seeing. And so these are, just a description of the image, title. You could also add things like the location and time where it was captured, if that wasn't originally captured on device. So thank you. Those are the prototypes that I wanted to walk through.
Great, thank you, Jen. Thank you, Eric. I wonder if you could talk a little bit now in the world of standards, from a standards perspective. What does it mean to define who within content credentials, and how do we get some consensus there?
Well, there's a funny thing. So I attend a conference called Internet Identity Workshop, which purports to answer that exact question. And a group of people got together in, I think, 2005 to have an Internet Identity Workshop. And they thought they would have a few of these and the problem would be solved. I just recently attended the 41st of those. So, we're still working on that question, to be sure. And part of that's because, understanding of technology has changed, the ability of computers to perform cryptography has changed, and frankly, the demands of the world have changed. And so, people keep bringing use cases such as the ones that we're bringing about content and how do you have persistent identity over time to that space, and saying, how do we define credentials that are understandable not just today, but over some lasting period of time after a piece of content is created. So does that answer your question, Santi?
Sure, but drilling down a little bit deeper, I mean, it seems like we have all sorts of different identifiers: organizational, individual, device level. Is there a lowest common denominator there that everybody can agree on and then build on according to the use case?
Short answer, no, there is not. There are at least two, and we've built a couple of different flavors, as I call them, of the CAWG identity assertion to reflect that. Part of that is that organizational identity has been well understood and well solved, and this is what leads to the lock icon in the browser window when you do business with your bank or with your government or some other major business. That lets you understand and have trust that the credentials that you enter are actually in service of your purpose at that other entity, and that you're really talking to, for instance, Chase Bank, and not somebody who's stolen the Chase logo and wants your password. So there's a flavor of identity for organizational identity in particular that goes by either public key infrastructure or X509 as sort of the primary names that it's used. And we have a flavor of the CAWG identity assertion that allows you to use those credentials in the context of signing the content that you've created. And so when I showed the examples a couple minutes ago of the BBC, that would be an example of using organizational identity to to identify yourself as the producer of a particular piece of content. When we talk to individual content creators, it's a very, very different story. And so, at the halls of a conference, such as I mentioned a moment ago, you hear things about standards from the W3C called verifiable credentials, verifiable presentations, decentralized identifiers, or DIDs. When you talk to individual content creators, though, they don't know any of these terms that I've just mentioned in the last minute. When we ask them about their notion of identity and who they are on the internet, they talk about their social media sites, they talk about their websites, they talk maybe about their government-backed identifiers, depending on whether they want to be known by that same name or whether they have a pseudonym or an alias or something else that they use instead. And those don't match very well. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing in the CAWG is to figure out how to build some bridges between those two worlds that we can use for this time. This is what we've called identity claims aggregation, which is basically adapting the W3C verifiable credential in a way that can be used for individual content creators for now. And now we're looping back and saying, for those who really have individual credentials of their own, can we make that accessible through this framework as well?
So it sounds like a balancing game around flexibility, but also the need for security and consistency.
Absolutely, it is.
And so what are as you approach that, it seems like there's a lot of necessary interoperability there that has to happen. What are the challenges in defining those identity standards so that everything sort of gels?
One of the big challenges, and I wanted to talk a little bit about agentic identity in this world as well, because that's becoming the hot topic, especially this year, is figuring out how to make credentials that last. So much of the current identity infrastructure is really about authorization to do something. The classic case is, I flash the mobile ID that's on my phone, and that gets me access to an airline flight, or it gets me access to buy alcohol or some other age-restricted product. But those are really transactional. The verification of whatever criteria it is that gains me access to those things happens today and is forgotten today. And so a year, a decade from now, it doesn't matter that I was, on a particular flight. With content, we introduce a new constraint that we have an arbitrary delay between the act of content creation and the act of content consumption. So, I might publish a piece of my photography today, and, anywhere from 3 minutes to 20 years from now, somebody might come along and want to know, who really produced that? And so a lot of the work that goes into this is describing me in a way that lasts for that period of time. And so we're pushing the identity community, I think, in some interesting and new ways to build credentials that are understandable over time.
And when we talk about agentics, this notion of bots that are working on behalf of somebody, how do we ensure that identity signals themselves don't become vectors for abuse through impersonation, coercion, bots, surveillance? There's a whole host of risks there. How are you thinking about those?
Yes. So, so much of that lies in who issues the credentials. And so when we look at what CTPA itself is doing right now with regard to building up its conformance program, a lot of that is building an infrastructure of trust that says, there is somebody out there who is vetting the implementations and issuing certificates that are really only available to those who have said they're implementing the CTPA technical standard in a compliant fashion. And so that narrows the field of who has access to produce content credentials that are widely accepted. And I think the same thing will be necessary for individual and organizational identity. So when we showed, for instance, the user experience example of the BBC, that trust came from the fact that the IPTC has established a list of reputable news organizations and placed the BBC on that list. I expect other industries will do similar, and also those who are issuing credentials to individuals will do similar. It's hard to say that there's a way for me as an individual to just stand forward and say, hey, I'm Eric Scouten and I'm producing content, because anybody could say that whether or not they have any real attachment to the name Eric Scouten. And so I think one of the important things for us is to be able to figure out how do you make that trade-off of understanding who a person really is in a particular context, in a particular community, maybe in some broader world, and also not creating too much of a burden of either revealing yourself in a context or in a government where that may be unwise, or creating too much effort. One thing I will say is I'm following closely the work of my friend Drummond Reed, who is building up a project called First Person Credentials, which is really thinking thoughtfully through that kind of question. And I think the end result is going to be something that they're going to build up a kind of credential that is going to be compatible with what the CAWG will be doing in the near future.
Right. It's a good point about, some people need to be anonymous or
Yes.
need to maintain their privacy. So I guess the challenge is, how do those people assert who they are and to what degree?
Yeah. So, at the moment, the story is that they don't. And the good news is that there's flexibility to do that, right? If you look at the C2PA standard itself, there is absolutely no mention of individual or organizational identity. It's entirely what hardware or software produced it and what can it attest to by itself. And there's intention behind the idea that what the CAWG does is structurally and organizationally separate from that. So for those who have legitimate and or whatever reason desires to be private and anonymous in their content creation, that is entirely possible simply by following the C2PA spec by itself. So for those who do wish to identify themselves, right now the mechanisms are fairly heavyweight, I would say, in the particular forms that I've described. But we are working currently in the CAWG towards addressing questions about how do I say, how do I leave a hook for myself that says, I created this piece of content, but I'm not telling you anything about myself today, but tomorrow I can come back and say, hey, by the way, I'm the person who created this content, and here's some new things I want you to know about me.
Right. That's fascinating. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the broader ecosystem. I mean, technology obviously moves at lightning speed. What are some of the emerging trends that you're seeing in how identity is being verified or asserted online, and how might these influence CAWG's work?
So, certainly we're watching the efforts of various jurisdictions, especially the EU, but also many states here in the US, to provide digital identity signals. So, what I talked about with being able to have your identity on your phone in a way that's widely recognized is emerging now. And we're watching to understand, are those signals that we can leverage in the context of the CAWG? And if so, are content creators actually interested in doing that? And that applies not only to individuals, but if you look at certain governments, the province of British Columbia is especially forward thinking on this front. Organizations that are registered as businesses or other kinds of organizations within BC have widespread access to digital credentials, and perhaps those can be leveraged in this framework as well. So that's probably a major thing. And then the question of, are there forms of credentials that people will understand online, such as the first person credentials that I talked about a couple minutes ago? Do those gain enough stature and adoption that they'll be interesting as a form of credential?
Right. Looking forward, putting our imagination cap on, how do you envision audiences interacting with identity information in content credentials? Do you think it will be visible, backgrounded, seamless? How are you thinking about that?
I look back 10 or 15 years at how we used web browsers at that time. So let's say 2010 as an example. I was recently doing some looking back at personal blogs and archives that I had written, and sort of stunned at the number of plain HTTP links that I looked at or that I linked out to. And that was really common practice then. I would go to HTTP blah 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 and not think particularly much of it, and my browser wouldn't say anything about it. And today, we're trained now to look askance at such sites, right? You really want to see that HTTPS that says, yes, in fact, I am conversing with this particular web server that represents this particular project, if you will. And our browsers are now, in fact, trained to put some sand in the gears and say your connection is not secure or things like that if you attempt to go to a site that doesn't have that kind of authentication behind it. And I think, and I hope, that in similar ways, content that has attribution behind it, both how it was produced, but also by whom, will stand apart from that doesn't. And, over time, you will start to expect that there is a story behind the content that you're viewing that makes sense to you. It may be a fun fictional story, but at least you know that that's what it is.
Right. All right. Well, thank you, Eric. We're going to open it up now to some questions from the audience. Simon Locke from Torth.io asks, can we add additional context around how we address or solve the issue of ensuring that bad actors are not able to create credentials that may be similar and confused with authentication for legitimate companies?
Certainly. So when you talk about organizational identity, I think a lot of thought is going to go into who has access to the kinds of X509 certificates or perhaps other credentials in future that really have some vetting done behind them to say that it is in fact a particular organization that's publishing something, right? What exactly that is still, I think, in flux and still to be defined. An example of that is what I showed with the Project Origin trust list that recognizes news media. And I would say that the news media are the most organized of any industry sector I've seen thus far in terms of thinking about wanting to vet and validate the organizations that are legitimately part of that industry. My hope is that other industries will see what we're doing with that and ask for the same kind of recognition. So you'd see, major car manufacturers or major recorded music stand up and say, this is really Sony Music or whoever it happens to be within a particular industry and recognized by their peers as a valid participant in that space.
Sure, thank you. Related to this, a question from Eugene Kuzyakov about identity being stolen. In other words, one thing is to impersonate somebody, the other is to get your hands on their identity certificates. And how do we think about that?
This is a big challenge. Individuals especially are sort of notoriously ineffective at managing passwords and certificates and things like that. So I think there will be some interesting work to be done, and I welcome input in the CAWG as to how to establish and I'm looking for the word, promote best practices in retaining credentials so that doesn't happen. It's absolutely a risk.
Right. What else keeps you awake at night, Eric?
Lots of things, but I think we built a pretty large bridge between individual content creators and the identity community in what we did with identity claims aggregation. And I think one of my big concerns is how do we bring those communities closer together? How do we make the technology that the identity community has built, which answers some of Eugene's questions, how do we make that accessible, usable, low friction, enough that people actually use that in widespread day-to-day communications?
Right. We have a question from Linda Puroaho, a broader question, and this may be relevant to people who are not as familiar with our work as some of the audience here, but it's really about the C2PA standard and what has made it best in class and so widely adopted and supported. I wonder if you could talk about that and then the adjacencies around the work that CAWG is doing.
Certainly. So I think the key thing for C2PA was being in the right place at the right time with technology that was well understood. And I recall from some of the early discussions in the formation of C2PA that a lot of what we were trying to do was to not invent something new, but to reuse existing technology, such as the X509 technology that I talked about a few minutes ago. Really to use those and assemble them in ways that made sense for this use case, but not to be, not to boil oceans and make, dramatically new technology where we could avoid that. And there were a number of people from many organizations, not just big tech and software, but camera manufacturers, news media, human rights organizations, who all came together and recognized this common need that one, there was the likelihood of what has actually happened with AI generative technology becoming a major cultural force, but also that the ease of sending information out on the internet without accountability would become an issue for all of these sectors, and there was common purpose in attempting to address that.
Right. Question from Cecilia Pasquini. Do you see possible integrations in the future with existing digital identity frameworks such as the EIDAS in Europe?
Yeah, so I did mention earlier that we are watching what Europe is doing with EIDAS and EIDAS 2.0 in particular, and really making it such that digital identity is available to pretty much all residents of that community. One of the challenges is that there are 27 member states of the EU, and from what I gather, there are at least 27 different implementations of these standards. So I think there's still some work to be done to understand, is there commonality even within that community? And then from that point, are we entitled under the laws there to make use of those credentials in this format? And then further, do people who have access to those credentials actually want to use them in this way? And so much that is contextual. An artist who uses their given name as their business presence, I think, might very much welcome that. Somebody who uses a pseudonym or has reasons to want to be anonymous would run away screaming from that. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of understanding that, but certainly we are working towards broader adoption of identity standards, including those available there and here in the US.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about the practical impact that CAWG's work will have on creators, journalists, consumers, and on their ability to trust and engage with digital content. How do you see that developing? In other words, one thing is to develop a technology. The other thing is to educate people about its existence, because at the end of the day, it becomes sort of a behavioral change. How do you think about those things?
Yeah, and that's a large part of the reason that we're here today is to make to help people be aware of the work that we're doing. I spoke on a podcast a year or so ago, and one of the things I said there was that there's this growing gulf between people who are in entertainment and government and news media and sports, all manner of content creation, and their audiences, because it's no longer clear that something that purports to be from any entity really is from that entity. And so I see our role, if we're at all successful, as helping to rebuild that bridge between content creators and their audiences.
That's great. Anything you'd like to leave us with, Eric?
Certainly, I want to give a shout out to my colleagues at the Decentralized Identity Foundation. CAWG joined DIF in March of this year. And a major part of the reason that we did that was to gain access to the community of identity professionals who are really familiar with the kinds of questions that have been raised here today. And I'm super happy to report that we're seeing some great leadership from other members of that community to help us build stronger bridges between content creators and their audiences. That's really the purpose that we had in mind when we made that move, and it's working out very well. So if you are an identity professional or a concerned content creator, I would absolutely welcome you to look at the work of CAWG, CAWG.io, where there's information about membership and the ongoing meeting series that we have where we define these standards, and invite you to that room. One of the questions that I often have, and I think going back to the question of what keeps me up at night, is I'm often wondering what we're missing. Where are the content creators that we haven't talked to who would benefit from this kind of connection with their audiences that we purport to have, and what technologies might be of interest to them that we haven't discussed already. So, it's if you think we're missing something, please speak up to me in private or elsewhere, and help us make that bridge those gaps.
Fantastic. So I think the call to action is, if you're interested, get involved. As Eric said, visit CAWG.io to learn more. If you're not yet a member of the Content Authenticity Initiative, please join us. Membership is free. It's a simple web form on our content.authenticity.org webpage. Keep an eye on CAI emails and LinkedIn for future events. And if you're a user of hardware and software, start asking your vendors to implement C2PA-enabled things, especially if you're an institutional user. So, one of the things that I've often remarked on over the last several years is that this is very much a community effort that's going on here, whether it's individuals coming together because they have an interest in provenance in these crazy times that we live in, or whether it's organizations coming together who have that same interest. And everybody is really pulling in the same direction, which is very, very heartening, and I think has led to a great deal of progress over quite a short amount of time when you consider that we got this rolling in late 2019, early 2020. Now we have a standards organization. Now we have massive advances in implementation. Google announced they're implementing C2PA in their latest Pixel phones. Nikon cameras announced a product today. LinkedIn is using this. All sorts of big players are getting involved in C2PA. So we're seeing this groundswell of implementation. And for many of those players, identity is super important. So the work that Eric and the folks at CAWG are doing is more relevant than ever. And I think with that, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We hope to do more events like this. If you are involved in something that you think is important and meaningful, please reach out. We consider applications to talk about things and highlight best practices and progress. And thank you, Eric. It's been a fascinating conversation. And thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you. So long.